Thank you for joining me and welcome to Paranormal Mysteries. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. On today's episode, we'll be covering time slips, shadow people, a disappearing man, a demon, the ghosts of two little boys, and much more. But before we start, I'd like to thank Brent and Nicole for their support and generosity. And for anyone else who would like to support the show, you can do so by sharing and reviewing the podcast, as well as visiting us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. And if you have a paranormal story to tell, you can contact me by email at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, through voice message at speakpipe.com/paranormalmysteries, or on our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. And remember that all of our links can be found in the show notes. And now, let's start the show with our first listener story of the night, which comes to us from Mike. And Mike says, I have two experiences to relay. In the first occasion, a very good friend and I were driving through the Blue Mountains in Australia. The night was near freezing, and the old car we were driving had a water leak just above the accelerator pedal. I was driving, and I had kitted myself out in my sleeping bag to keep warm, the bottom unzipped to stick my shoed feet out to operate the pedals. It was late, and we had been driving for some time, as a petrol station loomed into view. We needed a break, so we pulled in. It was the type with an entry and exit driveway, a low, neat hedge just after entry, bordering several car parks for the in-house dinners of the attached roadhouse facing the car parks. We parked here, exited the car, and went directly to the fuel station as the roadhouse was closed since it was late. We purchased our snacks, got back in the car, slid into our sleeping bags, and proceeded to hit the road. I drove out the exit, leaving what appeared to be a clean and modern but totally normal-looking fuel station. This is where it gets weird, and my buddy and I have been over this many times. The best way I can describe this is like what a film editor might do to a film they are editing, cutting and splicing, thereby removing the events in between. I have this memory of driving, but then a hiccup in reality, and just more driving. We then decided it was time for a break, as we felt we had again been driving for some time. A fuel station loomed again, and we started to pull in, and at this point, we both freaked out. It was exactly the same place we had left hours before. We were both flipping out now. It was the same roadhouse, the same hedge, with the same way that it was cut into the existing hillside, the same highway, the same everything. We parked and got out and started pointing and gibbering. It was all the same. We still cannot explain what we experienced. It was like we had spliced back into our reality, but the timing was off. It's so strange to this day. The second event involves one of those shadow people. Mine was similar to exactly how others described. Blacker than black. I felt the weight on the end of my bed, and I sat up, staring into this black shape. I rubbed my eyes. Was I seeing things? No, it was definitely an all-absorbing black humanoid figure, but with the outline of a coat and something over the head, but I could make out no details. Just the outline. My heart was pounding, but I've never been one to freeze in terror. I pulled my legs up, sat up, and proceeded to get to my knees and started moving toward it. This thing then got up off the foot of my bed, moved to the wall, and then disappeared. Somehow I knew almost immediately that it was not a natural person, but I didn't know what it was until today, when I heard your show. I might add that both of these events happened when my buddy was close by. He has never professed to be a believer, but over the years, he has seen things. Today, he often sees things, and I believe him. He can almost have these visions at will. He can see the energy flowing between all things. He relays messages and says things totally out of character, but afterwards he cannot recall having conversations. But he can recall what he has seen. My buddy and I are approaching our mid-50s now, and we had a break from each other for about 10 years. But we are now back in each other's lives, and he says his visions are strongest when he's around me. He says that we are not from here, and we are not in control. Regards, Mike from Brisbane. Our next story of the night comes to us from Bethany. and Bethany says, "Hey Nick, I'm a new listener to the podcast and I fell in love with the show. I wanted to send you a story of when I saw my mom, but she had passed away about 2 weeks before. My mom was a wonderful woman. She always helped me through my mental health problems, and she was the most caring woman you would ever meet, but she suddenly passed away. We don't know what ended up happening, but we know it wasn't suicide because her toxicology report didn't have anything suspicious like that. We gave the report to my FBI agent uncle to see if there was any malpractice due to her doctor visit the day before, but no. When my mom passed away, I was in horrible grief and depression set in. All I wanted was to tell her that I was sorry that I wasn't a really good daughter. I was very rebellious. It was about 1 a.m. and I was getting something to eat, and as I was about to go back to my room, I saw my mom walking from the kitchen to the living room. I ran after her, but when I entered the living room, she was gone. I've always been a believer in the paranormal, and it looked so much like my mother. I told my therapist, and she said it could just be my brain forcing me to grieve because I was trying to force myself not to because I had an autistic brother to think about. But I felt my mother's energy, and I truly believe that it was my mom. Ever since then, I have felt her energy and heard her voice every once in a while. I'm glad that she is watching over my family, but I hope that she can pass on to the other side with her father and best friend. I miss her, and I talk to her every day. Her name was Danielle, and I miss her so much. Please share this story to show other people who are grieving a loss of a mother that they are watching." Our next listener experience comes to us from CJ, and CJ's story is called Reoccurring Conscious Nightmares and a Last Goodbye. CJ says, "Hello, I ran across your podcast when trying to find ways to pass time while working. I've always had an interest in the paranormal and still do. After listening to other listener stories, I wanted to share 3 of mine since it seems like more people than I realized may have experienced this also. I have had a recurring dream since I was in middle school. When I say it out loud, it seems silly, but even as an adult, this dream causes me to wake up in a cold sweat with a racing heart. Now, I have night terrors from time to time, but this dream type is different. It usually starts with me being inside my middle school, but it's empty, it's eerie, and something is off. Things are always fuzzy to remember between the initial impression of the empty school and the main part, but I end up running and trying to find a place to hide in the locker room. I climb inside a locker and close it while trying to breathe as quietly as possible. That's when I remember that I am running from some sort of black-cloaked witch and a large dark creature that she controls. As I'm hiding in the locker, I can see through the slots in it, and I can hear those beings coming toward me, and I know deep down that if they get to me, I will be gone forever. I always wake up right before they find me, almost like I'm fighting to not let them take me away in real life. I don't remember too many dreams, but this one I always remember. Like I said, it sounds silly to me when I say it out loud, but when I jolt awake with my body in full terror response mode, it's unnerving. I wake up feeling as if I had just had to fight for my life, and usually feeling as if I haven't slept at all. My next experience is also about nightmares, but more specifically night terrors, but these are like a combined night terror and sleep paralysis. Since I was a young teenager, around the time the recurring dream started, I have had what symptomatically match night terrors, but at some point during this extreme nightmare, I realize that I'm dreaming. My conscious mind knows I'm asleep, but I cannot wake up. I am essentially trapped inside the dream. It all feels very real to me while I'm also trying to wake myself up, and I'm still experiencing the terrors of the dream. Eventually, I will start mumbling and screaming out loud in real life. The physical sounds I hear of myself yelling out in my sleep is what usually jolts me awake. I will wake up breathing hard and heart racing as if I just ran for my life, a full-on physical panic response. I have never remembered too many specific details about the night terror once I wake, but I always have the overwhelming knowledge that I knew I was dreaming and that I couldn't wake up. I was trapped inside my own nightmare, and I had to fight my way back to consciousness. To end on a lighter note, my last experience also has to do with dreaming. My husband and I got our first dog right before we got married. Unfortunately, he had an autoimmune disorder, and at 9 years old, it finally became too much, and he started to have more bad days than good. We made the extremely hard decision to put him down after discussing quality of life with our vet. It was devastating, and I worried if we had made the right choice. I had trouble sleeping for the first few days after his passing because I would be overcome with grief of missing him and would cry whenever I was alone. About 4 days after he passed away, I had a dream of him. We were walking down the road toward my house, and he was walking next to me, looking just like he always did. As we walked, he reached his head up and nuzzled my hand and licked it gently. I pet his head, and I can still remember the feeling of his fur under my hands from the dream. He then walked ahead of me towards the house, and I then woke up with tears streaming down my face. I knew deep down it was him letting me know that he was okay. He was letting me know that we did the right thing, and that he loved me. I am even tearing up right now while I type this. He knew I was struggling, and he came back one more time to let me know that it was okay. I'm not sure if these would be considered paranormal, but I thought they were worth sharing. Thank you in advance if you read this on the show. Our next story comes to us from Drake, and Drake's story is called The Smiling Boy. Drake says, "Hey Nick, I discovered your podcast a few days ago, and I'm absolutely hooked. I want to thank you for your hours of intrigue and entertainment, and also a thank you to your listeners for providing great stories. I have a few short stories about things I've experienced as well that have no explanation, but I'll leave it with my first experience. It was Super Bowl Sunday and I was about 18 years old. I'm 32 now. My close friend told me about a party that his coworker was throwing at his house for the game, and I decided to join him. When I arrived and walked inside the home, there were roughly 15 people, and it was made clear that it was a party for adults, as many Super Bowl parties are. The drinking and smoking solidified my observation. I was only there for about 30 to 45 minutes before I took a seat at the kitchen table to join a card game. That's when, in the corner of my eye, I noticed a small child peeking around the corner from the other room. He was only 6 or 7 feet away from me. I looked right at him, and he smiled at me. He was a very cute black boy who couldn't be older than 6, and he was wearing a red t-shirt and blue jeans. So anyway, I smiled and waved at him. We played peekaboo for about 30 seconds before he went behind the wall one last time, and I didn't see him for the rest of the night. Initially, I thought nothing of it, but shortly after I started asking myself questions. Why was this child present at this sort of party? I then asked myself, the child was black, yet everyone at the party was white. Where are his parents? Maybe he was adopted by a white family? I shrugged it off since I was distracted by the festivities, but by the end of the party, everyone was heading home. The party had trickled down to just the homeowners, my friend, and I. That's when I decided to ask the male homeowner, "So whose kid was that I saw earlier in the kitchen?" He then looked at me a bit shocked and quickly asked, "What kid?" I told him, "The little black boy in the kitchen." He quickly sprung up in excitement and called for his wife, who was in a different room. "Babe, come here. He saw the little ghost boy too." They continued to tell me past stories about the occurrences when they saw him. I couldn't believe it. The child looked just as alive as anyone else. It only makes me wonder how many other times I've encountered a ghost without even acknowledging it. Thanks for letting me share my story, and I wish you and your listeners good health. Drake. Our next story of the evening comes to us from Tay, and Tay's experience is called Tapping. Tay says, "This happened not too long ago, maybe 3 or 4 months at the very most. I can't recall most of the details, but it was right after I had rearranged my room. For a little bit of context, I just recently graduated, and as a gift, my parents offered to redecorate my room. I've got a smaller, square-shaped room. It's the only one downstairs and has a huge window and a 20-foot ceiling. Originally, it had a queen-size bed in the middle, pressed against the left wall, and just barely had enough room for a little nightstand between the bed and window, a tiny little TV stand in the corner, and a mirror on the other side. After the revamp, I have a large dresser on the right and a daybed in the upper left corner by the window with a bunch of space between the two. It was probably about 1 in the morning, and I was still up watching something random on YouTube. I had my head against the wall right by the window, and I was starting to get tired, and I turned the TV off. The room got dark, and the only other sound was that of my dog snoring. I started to settle in and shut my eyes when I heard a knock on my window. At first, I thought my state of extreme tiredness was making me imagine things, so I turned over to face the wall and shut my eyes again. But there was another knock, followed by tapping. At this point, I was starting to get freaked out, so I woke up my dog in an attempt to calm myself. Her name is Grace, and she's a portly little Chihuahua Terrier mutt. She's the sweetest dog I've ever met and loves to bark at new people and at noises. At first, she kind of sniffled around before we heard another set of taps on the window. Her head shot up, and she stared at the window. I was really shocked that she hadn't barked or let out a little playful growl, but was instead staring and acting timid. Now I'm really freaking out, and I'm way too scared to turn around. There were a total of 7 sets of knocks and taps, and when I eventually gathered the courage to flip over and peek out the window, there was nothing outside. Of course, I had waited a while before I turned, and whoever or whatever it was could have had time to leave. But I was way too scared to sleep that close to the window for the rest of the night. Our next listener experience comes to us from Macy, and Macy's story is called Little Blonde Boy. Macy says, "Hi Nick, I love your podcast. I've been listening to it for a while now. This isn't my story, it's my dad's, but he gave me permission to submit this. My dad told me that when he was younger, before his mom and dad, my nan and granddad, bought the house that they live in now, that a family lived there who had recently had a baby boy. After 2 years, the baby died of cot death. The family were so sad that they decided it would be best to move out and try to start over. They left the house and it became derelict because no one had bought it or decided to go in. After 5 years, my nan and granddad, my dad's mom and dad, bought the house and decided to do it up. After they had refurbished the house, my nan and granddad told me that my dad would be talking to someone upstairs on the 3rd floor, but he was the only one upstairs. Often, my dad would tell my nan that he was going upstairs to speak to the little blonde boy. When my dad was playing football in the garden, he would look at the window and start waving, and when my nan would ask who he was waving at, he would repeatedly say, 'The little blonde boy.' But my nan thought it was just his imagination. One day, my dad was upstairs talking to the so-called little blonde boy when my nan went upstairs and saw my dad throwing a tennis ball back and forth. When my nan walked in, she didn't see any little boy. She just saw a tennis ball floating in midair. Out of shock, she let out a small scream, and the ball instantly dropped. And after that, my dad said that he didn't see the little blonde boy for around 7 years. When my dad was 17, he started dating my mom, and one night they were babysitting my dad's younger brother, who coincidentally was blonde. They had ordered a pizza, and my dad told my mom to go and get money from upstairs to pay for the pizza. And as my mom ran upstairs, she got to the 3rd floor and saw a little blonde boy, and she chased after him thinking that it was my dad's brother. She chased him into the bedroom while saying, "Come downstairs, the pizza is here." But after she went back downstairs and paid for the pizza, she said to my dad, "Your brother is upstairs and hiding." My dad then replied by saying that he had been sitting here the whole time. That was the last sighting of the little blonde boy in my nan and granddad's house, but I've been on the 3rd floor many times when sleeping over and have always felt cold or felt like I was being watched. Thank you. Hopefully this will be on your podcast for me to listen to. Our next story of the night comes to us from Ben, and Ben says, "I want to thank you for giving me a place to submit my stories, because I have a few good ones, but I will do them one at a time. While growing up in the 80s and 90s, I never saw or experienced anything paranormal before high school, despite growing up in a part of Massachusetts called the Bridgewater Triangle. However, the story I'm about to share seemed to open the floodgates, as I have been experiencing the paranormal more and more in my life the older I get. This event occurred during July of 2003. I was out for a very late night jog, probably between midnight and 1 a.m. On the street I was living on at the time, there were a few houses and lots of woods. It was also intersected by power lines. I was passing these power lines when I saw a man working on the power lines. He was about 10 feet from me, so I said, "Boy, they have you guys working late tonight." The power line workers often were out there doing repairs or cleaning brush, so I really thought nothing of it. He said nothing and turned and walked in front of me, almost close enough for me to touch him. Then he started to get a glowing bright white as he walked, and then completely disappeared right in front of me. He took 3 or 4 steps, and the whole event probably took less than 5 seconds. However, it was absolutely incredible, to say the least. What really makes this story great is that about a week or so after experiencing it, and after telling my parents, something else happened no further than 50 yards from where this did. My mom saw a man walking in the middle of the road and yelled to my dad to watch out for that man. Well, my mom said that he completely disappeared in front of her. Needless to say that they believed my story after their very own experience. The thing that may tie this together is that the stretch of road it took place on was about 2 miles off of Route 44 in Rehoboth, Massachusetts, where the infamous red-headed hitchhiker ghost stories have taken place, a subject that you have covered on the show before. The ghost that I saw had black hair and had what looked like old military fatigues, as opposed to the red-headed hitchhiker who is said to wear red flannel. The thing is, he looked perfectly solid before I talked to him, so could he have been a real man who just knows how to disappear, or even travel differently than we know about? And did the fact that he was under the power lines have something to do with it all? When my parents saw him, he was not under the power lines, however. Thank you again, and I hope you're able to use the story. Ben. Our next story of the night comes to us from Manny, and Manny's story is called Demon in My Room. Manny says, "Hi Nick, this is my encounter with a demonic presence that I won't forget. It all started when my room was being remodeled by my dad, and for a couple of months I had to sleep in my sister's room. One night I woke up and wasn't able to move or speak. I knew I was in a state of sleep paralysis, and I was so freaked out because I had never experienced this before. I am a faithful Catholic, so I began to ask God for help, and I was then able to fall asleep. The next time I got sleep paralysis, I wasn't scared because I knew what was happening, so I tried to slap myself and wake myself up, but I couldn't move. I could barely wiggle my arm. It started happening more frequently until I had a dream that felt so real. I was in my house by myself and I had the need to go to my own room. As I opened my door and walked in, I saw the wood on the floor because my dad hadn't installed the tile yet. But as I walked in further, I noticed that something had clawed at my floor. The wood on the floor was destroyed to the point where I could see the basement of my house. And under the house, I saw a demon staring at me with the worst look I could imagine. I wasn't scared because I knew that God was with me. I was more angry that this thing was in my house, and it was not welcome. In my dream, I began telling God to cast this demon out of my house. I told it that my name was Emmanuel, and that God is with me, and that I don't fear it. I also called out to the Archangel Michael to get it out of my room. I remember that when I was casting it out in my dream, I heard the ugliest and scariest roar or scream that it let out, as if it worked. Ever since I had that dream, I have never experienced sleep paralysis, and I know that whatever that evil presence was in my dream, it was real, and it was the cause of my sleep paralysis. Thank you for listening, and God bless you and your listeners. As I bring tonight's episode to an end, I appreciate all of you for tuning in, and a special thank you goes out to Mike, Bethany, CJ, Drake, Tay, Macy, Ben, and Manny for sharing their experiences. And if you've witnessed something paranormal, I'd like to hear your story. You can contact me through email, voice message, or on our website, and these links can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great beginning to your week, and I look forward to seeing you back here on Wednesday as we continue our journey into the unexplained, right here on Paranormal Mysteries.
Finally, a bed that senses snoring and automatically responds. Meet the Ergosmart Base from Tempur-Pedic, our first system that detects snoring, then automatically adjusts by raising the bed. Get your best sleep, all night, every night. For a limited time, save up to $500 on select adjustable mattress sets and experience the deep, undisturbed sleep of Tempur-Pedic. Get full offer details at TempurPedic.com. Finally, a bed that senses snoring and automatically responds. Meet the Ergosmart Base from Tempur-Pedic, our first system that detects snoring, then automatically adjusts by raising the bed. Get your best sleep, all night, every night. For a limited time, save up to $500 on select adjustable mattress sets and experience the deep, undisturbed sleep of Tempur-Pedic. Get full offer details at TempurPedic.com.
Now through February 16th, join a clean and spacious Planet Fitness for zero enrollment and only $10 a month. With tons of equipment and free fitness training, it's the perfect place for everybody to work out.
Even me, Mr. I can't sleep at night, so I keep dozing off during the day.
Especially you, Snoozy. You'll rest easier and feel fit-tacular.
Wait, how did you get in here?
Join in club or at planetfitness.com. Zero enrollment, $10 a month. Cancel anytime. Hurry, deal ends February 16th. See club for details.
Happy October, everyone, and welcome to Paranormal Mysteries. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. On today's episode, I'll be talking about a not-so-imaginary friend, shadow people, sleep paralysis, Ouija boards, angels, and much more. But before we start, I'd like to thank Sophia, Maria, and Paula for their support and generosity. And for anyone else who would like to support the show, you can do so by sharing and reviewing the podcast, as well as visiting us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. And if you have a paranormal story to tell, you can contact me by email at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, through voice message at speakpipe.com/paranormalmysteries, or on our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. I'd also like to announce a new section that I just added to our forum, which is called Help. It's a place to find answers and give assistance regarding paranormal issues. So if you haven't already, head on over to our forum and follow our Help section to be informed of future posts from our listeners, or to post something yourself. And remember that you can find the forum on our website, and there's also a link to it in the show notes. And now, let's start the show with our first listener story of the night, which comes to us from Sasha. And Sasha's story is called My Not-So-Imaginary Friend. Sasha says, "Hello, my friend and I found your podcast as we were driving home on a road trip, and we binged as much as we could until we got home. Once I got home, I have continued to listen as much as I am able, and I have felt compelled to share a story with you. I have many stories of spirits and ghosts, and would share many more of them if you want. But this one was one that took years to understand, but it is one of my favorites now. While it is a little creepy, it is a happy ghost interaction, and one that is a fond memory for me. I want to start by saying that I apparently was a child who could see things that others couldn't, and I was far too young to know what a ghost was. I often would ask about people who no one else saw, but my family, who does not believe in the paranormal, would just write these off as a child's imagination. Once I was grown, my mother had told me about an incident that occurred when I was about 3 or 4 that creeped her out enough that she never forgot about it. Her and I were driving around, and I was strapped into my car seat in the back seat, and I asked my mom, 'Do you know what one of my favorite things to do is?' She asked me, 'What?' And I replied, 'To close my eyes super hard and press on them like this and see all of our dead ancestors.' She said that she replied, 'Oh, that's nice, honey,' and then changed the subject, but that it freaked her out because of what I had said and the fact that she did not know how I even knew the word ancestor, nor what it meant, but obviously I did. I am relaying this moment because it will be very fitting to the next part. So, here goes. Ever since I was around 2 or so, I had an imaginary friend. His name was Claude. I often spoke to him, about him, and played with him. I would even tell my family about this man. He was old, I would say, when in reality he was most likely only in his 30s, but to a child that seemed really old. He was super nice and played with me all the time. He was always dressed funny, at least to me, as he was always in a suit. My family just played along most of the time and assumed that he was just something coming from the imagination of a child. I played with Claude often and would often seem to know things about our family that I shouldn't, and when asked how I knew them, I would proudly say, "Claude told me." Again, my family just assumed that I was overhearing adult conversations because they didn't believe in the paranormal. As I grew older, I saw Claude less and less, and by the age of 7 or so, I no longer saw him that I can remember. Over time, I had honestly stopped even remembering him at all, but that all changed when I was about 13. At that time, my great-aunt was starting to have some real problems with her memory and being able to do basic housework. My mom became her power of attorney, and we would go over once a week to do some cleaning and take her grocery shopping and the like. On one of these trips, I was helping her clean out a cabinet that had some old photos shoved in the bottom. When I got to the last one to take to her so she could decide what she wanted to do with it, I was shocked. It was a portrait of a man. It was a portrait of my childhood friend. This was a photograph of Claude. He was a bit younger than the man I played with, and in this photo he was wearing a different outfit, but there was no mistaking who he was. I stood there just staring at the photo in pure shock. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. Eventually, after what seemed like forever, but was only a few moments, I numbly walked over to my great-aunt and asked her who this man was. She smiled fondly and told me that that was her husband, Buster, who had died in 1969. I was confused because that was not the name I knew him by, and since I was born in the 80s, there is no way that I could have known this face. I then asked her who Claude was, and she replied, "Well, that's him, silly. His real name was Claude, but as a child he got the nickname Buster, and it had stuck with him so much that everyone just called him that, and his real name was only for legal purposes. Why do you ask?" I gave her a lame excuse, not really ready to accept what was going on, and went on my way cleaning. But the photo and who he was stuck with me. Eventually, I then went to my grandfather and started to ask him about his brother, Buster. He was shocked that I wanted to know, but seeing as how I had always loved history, he just assumed I was looking for fun stories, and he told me a few. I sat and listened and came to the realization that my imaginary friend was not so imaginary. He was my great-uncle, and the suit that I always saw him in would have been very in fashion around the time that he died. I don't know why he gave me his rarely used real name, and not the name he went by. Maybe so no one in the family would pick up on it. When I asked my mom about him, she would often tell me that her and her Uncle Buster had been close before he passed away. I tried to talk to a few other family members about it too, but again they don't believe, so eventually I just let it drop. But I know the truth. My friend was not imaginary. He was my great-uncle who had been so close to my mother, and I believe he stayed with me until I grew old enough to not be so lonely, as I was the only child in my family anywhere near my age, and had no one to play with. So there is my story. I still think fondly of my great-uncle, and honestly his wife, my great-aunt, is one of my favorite family members, and I was close to her up until she passed away. Now I visit their grave every so often to leave flowers and just to say thanks to him for being my friend when I was a child, and to her for always being the fun aunt and loving me the way she did. Thank you for reading my story. Our next listener encounter comes to us from Ethan, and Ethan's story is called The Watcher. Ethan says, "Hi Nick. Originally, I never believed in any of the paranormal. I've been listening to your podcast since day one, but for me, it was more like a child listening to fairy tales. I wasn't a scoffer necessarily, because I enjoy listening to the stories of those who have had experiences, and I didn't hold it against them. I just didn't believe it was actually as they said. But all of that changed when I met the Watcher. See, I work in a manufacturing plant where we form machine parts. The entrance leads into the break room, and then to the machines that we use, such as laser cutters, metal folding machines, and press brakes. If you go past these into the second half of the warehouse, you pass inspection, the welding apparatus, and packaging and shipping. I work second shift where the packaging and shipping section is unused because it's night, and the trucks don't get sent out until the following morning. The lights we use are motion activated, so about halfway through my shift they'll turn off automatically due to lack of activity. That's when I met it. The Watcher, as I call it, shows up every now and again when I'm not expecting it. I found him because I work on the edge of packing and shipping, right next to the large doors that open up for trucks when they come to pick up our parts. We leave the doors open because the warehouse gets very hot and the fresh air is refreshing. I felt a cold breeze blow on me, and I assumed it was coming from outside. I reloaded my machine and went to get a breath because it had been 98 almost all day, and I needed to cool off. But when I got outside, the air was dead. There was no wind. Thinking I had missed the breeze and disappointed, I turned back around to go back inside and to my machine, and that's when I noticed a pair of red eyes watching me from just inside the edge of the darkened part of the warehouse. I brushed it off because I had been tricked before, much like the pile of clothes in your room that looks like a person type of thing. But when I got back to my machine, I noticed the eyes had followed me. They didn't go more than a foot from the edge of the light, but it was very clearly close. And as I kept looking at it, I made out a blacker-than-shadow humanoid form. Dissipating off of the profile was what I can only describe as shadow smoke, if that makes sense. I couldn't believe it, and I kept staring, trying to rationalize what it could be. Eventually, I got so fed up with not being able to explain it that I walked right up to it, and then walked through it. I felt the same cold air from when I thought a breeze came in, but colder and stronger, like wind instead of a breeze. Then the thing was gone, right as the automatic lights came on from my movement. I couldn't believe it, and I was actually scared of the paranormal for the first time in my life. I was afraid to talk to anyone about it, but I eventually opened up to my coworker at my station, Morgan, who had worked there for 7 years. I couldn't believe it when Morgan told me that a couple of the guys I worked with had also seen the Watcher. He laughed and told me that it always picks on the newbies the most, which gave me mixed feelings. The guys who have seen it call it Phil, just because. But I like poetic names, so I dubbed it the Watcher, because that's what it does. It watches us. Always. I've seen it a couple times these past few weeks, always being just inside the darkness. Always watching. I don't believe it to be hostile, and none of the guys I work with have had any negative experiences with Phil. I know it doesn't like the light, because I pulled the stunt I tried the first time I saw the Watcher a month and a half ago, and I walked right into it, turning on the automatic lights. I felt the same cold air as it dissipated, and I didn't see it for 3 weeks. Morgan told me that it doesn't like to be messed with, because he had tried to take a picture of the Watcher, and it didn't come back for 2 months. I don't know why it keeps coming back, or why it watches us, or why it doesn't retaliate, but it's always there, just inside the darkness. And if I move behind my machine so it's out of view, it moves to another shadow, where it resumes watching me. I want to try to talk to it, but I am unsure, and I feel like I should just let it be. Morgan and I still see it occasionally, and I want to talk to the workers on the shift after me and see if they have seen the Watcher. I'll update you if anything changes. Thanks for reading. Our next experience comes to us from Lee, and Lee's story is called UK Ouija Board Experience. Lee says, "Hi Nick, love the show. In 1992 I was a student, and during the summer was working as a bar guy at a holiday camp to make some money. After our shifts we'd get together and do Ouija boards for something to do. They mostly gave us correct answers to personal questions that people asked in the room. One night we asked the board what would happen to a guy called Dean. The board then said that he would die by being stabbed in 7 years' time. It also said that he would get sacked for taking liberties with M. As we worked behind the bar, we all thought that he would get sacked for taking money. Anyhow, the next night came and he was caught kissing a customer when he was on duty, and he was sacked. Her name was Melanie. I didn't keep in contact with him, and I don't know if he did get stabbed or not. So when university restarted, I go back to my student lodgings and I decided to do a Ouija board on my own. I used letters on pieces of paper and an upturned glass. I couldn't get the glass to move on my own, and I was getting frustrated. I got worked up, put the glass the right way up, and shouted several times for it to give me a sign. The glass then shattered inwards upon itself. I wasn't touching it, and I was about 3 feet away. Naturally, this scared me, and I immediately vowed never to do this again. I've since done some reading about Ouija boards, and I would never do a Ouija board. I'd also advise anybody else to stay away from them. Take it easy and keep up the great work. Lee. Our next story of the night comes to us from Ethan, and Ethan's story is called Sleep Paralysis and the Guardian Cat. Ethan says, "Hey man, I got into your podcast a few weeks ago and think it may be a cool place to share some of my own experiences. Here's the most recent and most poignant to myself. Quick bit of background. Ever since I was a child, I would experience sleep paralysis episodes in lieu of archetypal nightmares. While there always was an unplaceable ominous feeling of dread whenever they would trigger, I never saw any kind of entities, and from a young age just assumed it was a natural fear of not being able to move. As I grew older, they happened less and less, but never have stopped altogether. Fast forward to 2020, I'm living with my ex-girlfriend in a small apartment with her cats and my husky, and we were babysitting her mother's Pomeranian. As we all know, it was a tough year, and for some reasons I can't remember, my girlfriend and I were having a disagreement and went to bed with emotions running high, something I always tried to avoid, but was unable to in this instance. That night, for the first time in years, I awoke only to realize I was experiencing a sleep paralysis episode. But this time was different. Instead of the usual dread that accompanies my sleep paralysis that I can compartmentalize, I was filled with feelings of abject terror. Even still, I wondered why I was so afraid, but before I could even complete the thought, I heard a loud thud from the living room that sounded akin to someone dropping a heavy wooden stump on the carpeted floor. Somehow I knew it was a footstep, though it was heavier than anything I could imagine. A second footfall turned my veins to ice. Whatever it was making its way down the hall to the bedroom, and its stride was as inhumanly long as it was heavy. Whatever it was, as it approached, the fear that gripped me tightened its hold. Right before the entity got to the doorway, and there's no way whatever it was could have fit through it, the thing was massive whatever it was, I felt a soft thud on the bed next to my head. My ex's black cat, Thomas, had leapt on the bed, and as I was on my back, I could see him from where he landed. His fur was standing on end as he was staring at the doorway, and began hissing, and the footsteps halted. In that moment I sprang awake, and Thomas was exactly in the position he had been in during the sleep paralysis. This is the first time that anything from a sleep paralysis episode translated directly into the waking world, and this convinced me that something had indeed been there. My ex had some direct run-ins with whatever entities stalked the place, but I'll always be grateful to Tom the cat for stopping whatever it was that was making its way to our bedroom. Hopefully I can convince my ex to send you what happened to her in the weeks that followed. I have had more brushes with the paranormal from my younger years, but I'd like permission from those involved before sharing those. I hope you are well. Ethan. Our next story of the night comes to us from Gina, and Gina's story is called Glitch in the Matrix. Gina says, "Hi Nick, I've been listening to this podcast for a while now and I love it. I think it's time I shared some strange experiences that I've had in the past. The glitch in the Matrix occurred recently when I was moving into my college dorm room. To rent a moving cart, you had to leave your driver's license and would have it returned to you whenever you returned the cart. At the front desk, while I was dropping off my license, my mom and I noticed a donation sign that stated that the university was accepting donations for a local child's cancer treatment center. After moving all my belongings in, I went to go return the cart, and my mom handed me a few dollars to give to the receptionist for the cancer center donation. When I got my license back, I started to hand her the money, and I told her that it was a donation. She had no idea what I was talking about. I then started to look all around the desk for the sign I saw earlier, but there was no sign. She said the donations were not accepted by the university like that, and that she hadn't known of any fundraiser like that of any kind. When I told my mom about this, she even went back to the front desk to see for herself, because we had both seen the sign and acknowledged it. It was a strange occurrence that I hope to never forget." Our next experience of the night comes to us from Cassie, and Cassie's story is called Angel in the Corner. Cassie says, "Hi Nick, I've been meaning to write this for a while. It is just one of my experiences. I find it comforting, so it is my favorite. I had 2 boys 11 months apart. When they were little, they shared a room with their cribs on either side of the small bedroom. From the moment they started to speak, both would point to the corner of their bedroom by the ceiling. They would always tell me and my husband things like, 'There he is, Mom, there he is,' and then point to the corner of the room. We thought it was weird, but I believed in angels and spirits, so I assumed it was a guardian angel. They weren't afraid and seemed to like him, until they didn't. Eventually, as they grew up, they realized that they shouldn't be seeing a man in the corner of their room, and my oldest began crying about it. The second night of crying, I went into the room. I thanked the angel for protecting them, and I explained that they were becoming scared and that it couldn't show itself to my boys anymore. The next night, the boys didn't see him and never said it again. They have no memory of it as they were so little, but we've told them the story frequently. My boys are young men now, and I still often feel that they have guardian angels close to them. I have other stories I may send another time, but this one was very special to me. Have a beautiful day, Cassie." Our next experience of the night comes to us from Allie, and Allie's story is called Shadow Figure. Allie says, "Hello, I live in Portland, Oregon. I have been a fan of your show for over a year now, and I enjoy listening to everyone's different stories. The story I'm going to tell you is about a shadow figure that tormented my childhood for many years. It all began when I was 8 years old, and we moved to a new home that is fairly new. At the time, my dad was away, and it was just my mom, my brother, and I living in the house. The first night we stayed in the house, my brother and I slept in my mom's room, and in the middle of the night I woke up by myself, and I could see this tall, jet-black figure standing in the doorway of my parents' bedroom. When I saw the figure, it was just standing there, as if it was looking ahead with its arms down on its side. It never moved or said anything. I was a little freaked out, but I ended up falling back to sleep. Later that week, my mom and I were in the car together, and I ended up telling her about the dark shadow that I saw, and she turned to me with a shocked look on her face and told me that last night she woke up and both my brother and I were asleep, and she saw the figure standing in the doorway. And she told me that the figure looked exactly like what I described. There were many times I had seen this dark figure in the house, and there were a few times that really stood out to me and still scare me to this day. The first one I will tell you about is when I was living in my house for over a year at this point. I was in my bedroom with my dog, who is very motherly and protective of my brother and I. I had my dog sitting on the bed, and I was facing my TV, and the screen was off. I had my bedroom door open, and while I was looking at my TV, I saw this tall dark figure walk by with its arms and legs moving. At the same time, when I saw this figure on the TV, my dog turned to my door and started growling. This moment has always stayed with me because my dog never growls at anything, and this was the first time I ever heard her do it. The second time I will tell you about is one of the scariest events for me. At the time, my grandma was spending the night while my parents were on a weekend trip. That night, my brother and I slept in the room with my grandma, and when you are in this room, you can see my brother's bedroom door. When this event happened to me, I was the only one awake, and the hallway lights were on, and I could see my brother's bedroom door. I was sitting in my recliner chair, watching TV. I started hearing noises as if someone was walking down the hall. I started hearing footsteps, and I could see this tall shadow on my brother's bedroom door moving, and I heard this growling noise coming down the hallway. I was scared to death when I heard the growling, and the noise was getting louder and the shadow was getting smaller, as if it was getting closer to the doorway of the room it was in. I immediately ran to my grandma's door and shut it. I slammed that door and woke my grandma up. I told her what had happened, and she did not believe me, and she made me keep the door open. As I have gotten older, I have enjoyed learning more about the paranormal, and I believe these experiences have made me want to learn more. There are many other stories that I can tell you, but I will leave you with these 2 stories. I will write the show again and share more of my paranormal experiences in the home I have lived in since I was 8. Take care, Allie. As tonight's edition of Paranormal Mysteries comes to a close, I appreciate all of you for tuning in, and a special thank you goes out to Sasha, Ethan, Lee, Ethan, Gina, Cassie, and Allie for sharing their experiences. And if you've encountered something that you can't explain, you can contact me through email, voice message, or on our website, and these links can be found in the show notes. And as we get closer to Halloween, I've got some interesting topics in store that I think everyone will enjoy, so stay tuned. Until next time, I hope you all have a safe and healthy weekend, and I'll see you back here on Monday with our next episode. From everyone at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.
Finally, a bed that senses snoring and automatically responds. Meet the Ergosmart Base from Tempur-Pedic, our first system that detects snoring, then automatically adjusts by raising the bed. Get your best sleep, all night, every night. For a limited time, save up to $500 on select adjustable mattress sets and experience the deep, undisturbed sleep of Tempur-Pedic. Get full offer details at TempurPedic.com.
There's no community like a Cenex community, and that's why every Cenex store is so proud to serve theirs by supporting local athletic teams, promoting the arts, and making sure each store is a place its neighbors can find what they need, catch up with their friends, and stay connected. It's also why we give back, helping to make the wonderful places we call home the best they can be. Your local Cenex doesn't just work in your town, it lives there. The store next door, powered locally at Cenex.
Finally, a bed that senses snoring and automatically responds. Meet the Ergosmart Base from Tempur-Pedic, our first system that detects snoring, then automatically adjusts by raising the bed. Get your best sleep, all night, every night. For a limited time, save up to $500 on select adjustable mattress sets and experience the deep, undisturbed sleep of Tempur-Pedic. Get full offer details at TempurPedic.com.
Thank you all for joining me, and welcome to Paranormal Mysteries. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. On today's edition of From the Forest, I'll be talking about Dogman, a cult, Goatman, and much more. But before we start, I'd like to thank all of you for your support and generosity. And remember that anyone can show their support simply by sharing and reviewing the podcast, as well as visiting us at patreon.com or buymeacoffee.com. Also, if you have a paranormal experience to share, you may contact me by email at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, through voice message at speakpipe.com/paranormalmysteries, or on our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. And all of our information can be found in the show notes. And as we bring 2021 to an end, I'm curious to know which listener stories were your favorite. Maybe you connected with a particular story because it was similar to your own experience, or perhaps you have a favorite simply because you found it especially creepy. Either way, just send me an email or a message on social media with the episode number and the title of the story or the name of the storyteller, and I'll add the most popular stories to our end of the year wrap-up. And with that in mind, tonight's first From the Forest encounter comes to us from Anna. And Anna's story is called My Terrifying Tenting Experience. Anna says, "Hi Nick, I love your podcast and how you let people tell their stories without judgment. I've been a listener since last year. If you decide to share my story, Thank you so much in advance. I have always been very sensitive and had very high intuition, but as a kid I didn't really know what that gut feeling was, or just knowing things before they happen. I have also had predictive dreams, and as I wake up in the morning, it feels like the problems I've been having have had a conclusion in my dreams. I feel other people's energy, and it can be very exhausting, but I take it also as a gift, and I can understand people better with it. So, onto the experience. I was 13 years old and was with my parents at our cottage. The house was originally my grandpa's. My grandpa died back in 2007, and the house was left to my mom as a place to escape the stress and rush of a city. The house is located more in the countryside and has only 2 neighbors close to it. It was the summer of 2014, and I had decided to sleep outside the house in a tent, since the backyard was pretty big, and the house was right in front of me. It was nighttime, and I was staying up late, listening to music from my earpods and reading a book in the tent. I think it was about 4 a.m., as my music stopped for a few seconds to load a new song, since I was listening to music from YouTube. In that few seconds of silence, I started to hear ruffling from outside. First, I didn't think much of it, but then the sound became louder, and I recognized it to be footsteps. Footsteps were coming from the dirt road that leads to our house yard. I stopped the music and started listening to the sounds, as I was confused who that would be, and I immediately identified the footsteps to be coming from a human, not an animal. Footsteps were coming closer and closer to the tent I was in, and I started calling out to my dad as I thought that he had woken up and went for a night walk or to smoke a cigarette, since he used to smoke back then. But there was no answer, and I called out again. My thoughts started running wild. I was confused by that as well. If it was my dad, how could he have walked from our yard to the dirt road without me hearing it? Maybe my music was too loud? As I didn't get an answer from my dad, I started to panic and had a really bad feeling about this. Was an intruder coming to the house? I took my phone, and as I waited for my dad to answer, I heard the steps coming right in front of the entry of the tent. Finally, my dad answered. His voice was grumpy, as I had woken him up. In a panic, I just asked, "Isn't that you outside?" He then said, "No, you woke me up." And I then started frantically breathing and whispering, "There is someone in front of my tent. Please come quick." Throughout the call, and also as it ended, I listened very carefully for the sounds, but there was none. The steps had stopped in front of my tent. I was too scared to breathe or make a sound. I was imagining someone opening the tent entry. But as I thought of this, I heard my mom and dad come outside. At this point, I was crying hysterically. I was so scared but relieved that my parents came outside, but I was scared that they would meet up with the intruder. My parents said, "It's okay, there's no one here, come outside." And I then slowly opened the entry. My dad checked the yard thoroughly, but I was now very confused. No steps were taken after they had stopped in front of my tent, like this thing had just disappeared into thin air. I told this to my parents, but of course they brushed it off as an animal. But I knew that wasn't true. I went to sleep inside the house, but in reality I didn't sleep at all that night. I was terrified. After that night, I haven't slept in a tent, and I won't sleep alone in a tent ever again. Thanks for reading my story, and much love to you and the listeners. Anna. Our next listener experience comes to us from Brian, and Brian's story is called Did I See a Goatman? Brian says, "Hi Nick, I hope all is well with you and the listeners. I wrote in last year or so about an experience I had in my parents' home with shadow men holding me down in bed. I'm writing in now for possible help from another listener. My grandpa's woods have always creeped me out, and everyone in the family except him are leery of the woods. People have had ghost, Bigfoot, and Dogman experiences. I have seen all 3 and have some relative knowledge on the subject matter of them. There are Indian graves on the land that we suspect due to having rocks cut in half with carvings on them. But back to the topic, I saw a Goatman, and that's a new one for me. We have chickens on Grandpa's land, and we put them away for the night around 7:30. Other than odd noises and quick shadows, it was uneventful. Last week, my wife and I went over to do the chickens, and it was very dark that night for some reason. We saw a flash of light zoom across us from the woods to the chicken coop area, and my wife felt that it was our lights reflecting off of something. There was really nothing but an outhouse and a tractor. I should say that due to some events, I now carry a .38 when we go. I loaded the gun when arriving, and the chickens were huddled in the corner with the rooster in the doorway, freaking out. My wife quickly closed the door and said that she was getting a hair-tingling fear, which is unusual for her since she doesn't believe in ghosts or the other experiences that we've had there. I then put my window down and listened to the outside noise, and it was quiet, like scary movie quiet. Something big was in the woods walking loudly. I decided to leave due to not wanting to shoot a creature, hostile or not. When pulling out of the driveway, I noticed that something came out of the woods and ran next to us. It was a humanoid shape and had a goat head with red eyes. I was going about 30 miles per hour, and it was right next to my door. The best way to describe it was as if it was parkouring through obstacles as it was trying to get to my truck. I punched it and got out of there. My wife admitted to seeing something, but she does not want to talk about it. Any suggestions or research clues, please let me know. Brian. Our next story of the night comes to us from Charles, and Charles's story is called The Cult. Charles says, "My family and I have experienced a lot of paranormal things, but this is the story I want to tell to the listeners. I am writing you to tell you about the events that happened to my family in 1991. My parents purchased a home in Sturgeon Lake, Minnesota in 1987. It was an area called Hogan's Acres, and it was not a very populated area. My parents' house was on Devil's Elbow Road. This area was a tree plantation, and there were lots of woods and unexplored areas. The area had all these strange craters dispersed everywhere. They looked as if a tree had been torn out, yet there was no tree. They varied in size and shape, and my parents had one on their property in the trees, roughly 20 yards from the house. In 1991, I was 9, and my older brother was 11. My dad built us a treehouse in front of the crater. The treehouse was enclosed on both the top and the bottom, and the crater was around 8 feet long by 4 feet wide, and it was deeper on one end more than the other. One morning when my parents were at work, I went outside to work on the ladder going up to the treehouse. We had slabs, which were unfinished boards used for firewood, going across the trees as a ladder. I wanted to saw off the boards so they were even with the trees. I had a hammer and a hand saw in my hand, and I was sawing and hitting the slab when all of a sudden a man dressed in all black with a black fedora-type hat walked from behind the treehouse with a large knife in his hand toward me. I screamed and threw the hammer and saw at him, but they went right through him. This guy was 4 feet from me, and there was no way I could have missed. I ran to the house crying and screaming for the babysitter, and things would start to get weird after that encounter. For the next few months, my brother and I would see 3 men on the roof of our parents' house. The man in black, a man with white coveralls and a melted-looking reddish face or mask, and a third one. The family would hear them on the roof at night as well. The police were there all the time, and it was in the evening news. We couldn't go anywhere without being asked if it was true. They didn't believe us, but my parents did. Someone would also come at night and tap on the windows of my parents and our bedrooms with sticks that they would leave outside my parents' window. My dad is an avid hunter and woodsman, so we went out to explore the area after that, and he found sacrificial altars made of rocks in the woods with dead animals. My dad had 2x4s across all the windows for fear that someone would try and break in to take us. Enough was enough, and my dad sent my mom and my brother and I out to stay at my grandparents' for the weekend. My dad and my cousin would stay at the house and wait with rifles in hand for whoever was terrorizing us, and it was late fall by this point. My dad slept in his bedroom, and my cousin was on the couch next to the patio window, going out to the large deck. Sometime during the night, my cousin heard someone running on the roof and then jumping down onto the deck. He looked outside and didn't see anybody there. My dad ended up tearing down the treehouse after that and filled in the crater, and everything stopped. Now, fast forward to 2013. I am working at a restaurant in Cloquet and making chit-chat with one of the new front-of-the-house managers. Come to find out, she grew up in Sturgeon Lake. What are the odds? So I tell her, me too, I'm from Hogan's Acres. And she says, get out of here, me too. She is 10 years older than me, and I figured, what are the odds? So then I asked her if she ever heard of the cult, and she had. She was one of my babysitter's girlfriends. So we started talking about it, and it brought up a lot of memories for me, and a lot of them are fuzzy. So I started Google searching, and I could not find anything. This was on the news and in the papers, so I went home and I asked my dad why I couldn't find anything on it, and he told me that the FBI took all the records of it. It's so crazy. I know there was a lot more that happened that I can recall, as I was 9 years old. But here's the creepy part. Remember I said that there were 3 men on the roof? Both my brother and I can describe what 2 of the men looked like, but neither of us can tell a description of the third. But we both know there were 3 of them. Our next experience of the night comes to us from Alistair, and Alistair's story is called The Entity from the Woods. Alistair says, Hey Nick, I appreciate what you do, and you've inspired me to do something I've been wanting to do for a long time. Thank you for that. I will warn you that this story will be rather long due to details. I'll start off by saying that I've experienced paranormal and otherworldly incidents for as long as I can remember. I am not a medium or an empath. I am not exactly sure what I am, but my third eye and sixth sense is stronger than the average person's. Most of my experiences happened while I was alone, but this particular one, my mother experienced with me. To set the stage for this story and others, let me explain a few things. I have always had night terrors, which is important for this story, but I have another story about that for later. Moving on, my parents' house sits on the edge of the woods, so the backyard is wooded, and I've never liked this property. We moved there back in 2007 when I was 9, and activity started almost immediately for me, but quickly worsened for me when people started cutting down the forest a bit behind our property lines. There was still woods for a good 20 feet past our yard, though. My parents still currently reside there, and I still have nightmares surrounding their house. This particular incident happened back when we had horses, and I was around 14. I had been having a reoccurring dream about an entity that stayed deep in the woods by the backyard, and the odd thing is, even in my dreams I couldn't see him. I could only hear him. He would whisper in my ear, and I would be locked out of the house. I would beat on the door and get this overwhelming feeling of panic. Most of the dreams ended with nothing happening, but I would have bad sleep paralysis. Though these dreams plagued me, nothing ever happened in the waking world with this entity until about a month after they had started. My parents' house has 3 doors, one in front, one in back, and one on the left side where you're looking at it from the front. The side door leads out to the horse corral within the fencing. If you step down the stairs, turn to your right and walk about 6 feet, where you're at an angle that you get a clear look into the woods. This, unfortunately, was also the same angle that this entity could be felt from. I think he hung out there because he could see our entire property from this spot. A storm was rolling in. I can also feel energy very well from storms, especially from the wind. This storm carried a feeling of dread that was building up with every minute. My mom and I stepped out the side door to give our horses some treats and brush them. It was getting dark out as evening slowly turned to dusk, including the darkening clouds. I kept getting chills up my spine. My root chakra is the strongest, so my spine tends to react before I know what's happening. I almost immediately looked out to the woods, and I could feel his presence strongly. My mom has been an on and off practicing witch most of my life, so I quickly walked over to her and explained the feeling of being watched from that spot. I had not told her about my dreams because of their content, and sometimes I'm very private about them. She looks out to the spot and instantly feels it as well. We calmly but quickly keep tending to the horses, and by the time we're done, it's just about completely dark, and I feel it stronger than ever, even stronger than my dreams. My mom feels it as well, so we go inside, and as soon as we go inside, it starts storming. After about a half an hour, there was a loud crash of thunder, and the horses went crazy. My mom and I still had a feeling of absolute dread, so we opened the side door and stepped out onto the steps. We had to use flashlights as our floodlight had recently had a wiring mishap. The rain had died down to a light mist at this point. We made it to the bottom step, and I start hearing steps in the mud coming closer to us from the stables, which are in the farthest corner from where we're standing. I knew that it wasn't the horses instantly, as the pattern of steps matched one of 2 legs, and not 4. I'm an audio learner, so my hearing is very good, and I can memorize by ear instead of sight, so patterns by ear are easy for me to detect. My mom thought it was one of the horses, and the steps were getting closer, and I had an overwhelming sense of get the hell out of there, but my mom still wasn't listening. To convince her, I shined my flashlight to the corner adjacent to us to show that all 3 of our horses were huddled and watching the same area that I am hearing the steps coming from. My mom then utters out a cuss word as we slowly back away from the corral and onto the steps. By this point, the steps had hastened into a jog, and my body was tingling with the sense of fight or flight, and I would have fought, but just like the dreams, I couldn't actually see him. My mom realizes this at the same time as me, and with one more step to go, we practically tumbled into each other into the house and locked the door. When we got into the house, I could sense his anger seething through the window, yet I still didn't see him. Neither did my mom, who does actually have the gift of sight. She couldn't even picture what he looked like, and some of the audience who are medium, psychic, or witches will understand why that's odd. The dreams still come after this incident, but not as frequently. I too am now a practicing pagan, and to this day, I still don't know why we could never see him. I have plenty of other stories that I will share here soon, but a word of advice. A lot of people have this misconception that if you ignore a presence, it weakens it. It will with some cases, but if you are gifted or special, they seek you out with intention. I know this from personal experience as I went through an atheist stage for a short period of time when I was younger. I guess I hoped that if I ignored the occurrences and pretended that they weren't real, they would stop. They did for a short period of time, but then they became 10 times worse. You'll know if you're gifted. There are very obvious signs of it. I am much more embracing of it now, and it helps. And if anyone ever needs help, please have Nick reach out to me. Thank you for sharing if you choose to, and blessed be friends. Our next listener experience comes to us from James, and James' story is called My Dad's Story. James says, "Good evening, Nick. I am back with another story. This, as the title suggests, is a story my dad told me. My dad has since passed, so I can't ask him again for clearer information. But this is the story he told me. When he was young, he lived in a house with his mom, dad, sister, and brother. His brother's name is Danny, and people always called him Bug. This is important so you know who I'm talking about. Now, they didn't live on a farm per se, but they did have a lot of land, and they did raise cows. Now, for about a week or so, every morning they would check on the cows, and they would always find at least one dead and partially eaten. After losing so many cows to whatever this was, my grandpa came to my dad and said, 'Look here, Bug, those cows are yours and Danny's responsibility. The next time something happens, you need to stop whatever it is.' So my dad and uncle came up with a plan to stay up all night until they solved the problem. So one night they were in the house when the cows started mooing and crying. My dad and uncle grabbed their guns and rushed outside to kill what they assumed to be a coyote. So they rush out and head towards the far end of the cow pasture, where there is clearly a cow on the ground. As they get closer, they see what they think is a wolf or a coyote eating the cow. They tried to get a little closer when I guess this thing heard them, and it looked at them. My dad said that it had the face of a dog, but it was much bigger. It had long hair and what looked like arms as opposed to dog or wolf front legs. This thing stood up to easily 6'8", and my uncle is 6'5", and this was taller than him. It then turned away and ran on 2 legs, back into the woods. They never told their parents what they saw because they didn't think anyone would believe them. My dad swore that it was a werewolf, but I don't think it was. It sounds to me more like a skinwalker, or maybe even a dogman, or maybe I'm just as confused as him, and it's something else completely. If anyone listening to this has ever played the video game Bloodborne, I got the impression that it looked like the boss called Beast-Possessed Soul, but minus the horns. I hope you enjoyed my dad's story. I know if he was around, he would love for his story to be told. He was always into the unexplained stuff, and he's the one that got me into it as a kid. Thanks for taking the time to read. Your fan, James. As we bring tonight's edition of From the Forest to an end, I appreciate all of you for tuning in, and a special thank you goes out to Anna, Brian, Charles, Alistair, and James for sharing their experiences. And if you've had a paranormal experience that occurred in or near the forest, you may contact me through email, voice message, or on our website via the links in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great beginning to your week, and I look forward to seeing you back here on Wednesday as we continue our journey into the unexplained, right here on Paranormal Mysteries.
And we're back. Well, tax season's here, folks, and you know...
Hi there.
Whoa, where'd you come from?
April here to tell you about the tax filing software from TaxAct.
Seriously, were you, hiding behind my desk?
Seriously, TaxAct makes it easy to get your maximum refund.
Well, you heard it here first, folks.
Switch to TaxAct today, and you can start for free.
Or, as we say in Radioland...
Subtle. TaxAct. File for less and get more.
See taxact.com for details.
Finally, a bed that senses snoring and automatically responds. Meet the Ergosmart Base from Tempur-Pedic, our first system that detects snoring, then automatically adjusts by raising the bed. Get your best sleep, all night, every night. For a limited time, save up to $500 on select adjustable mattress sets and experience the deep, undisturbed sleep of Tempur-Pedic. Get full offer details at TempurPedic.com.
Family. It looks a little different for everyone. For some, it's mom and dad. For others, roommates who feel like family. And for others, it's your significant other, their golfing buddies, your children, a high school soccer team starting lineup, and oh look, they're all taking you up on the offer to stay for dinner, really testing the limits of that phrase, the more the merrier. But no matter where you call home, Geico makes it easy to bundle and save on home and car insurance. Easier than making 3 frozen pizzas and assorted frozen veggies into a cohesive meal.
Thank you for joining me and welcome to Paranormal Mysteries. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. On today's episode, I'll be discussing Slender Man, shadow people, haunted military bases, and a strange visitation. But before we start, I'd like to thank all of you for your support and generosity. And for anyone who would like to support the show, you can do so by sharing and reviewing the podcast, as well as visiting us at patreon.com/paranormalmysteries or at buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. And if you have a paranormal story to tell, you can contact me by email at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com, through voice message at speakpipe.com/paranormalmysteries, or on our website at paranormalmysteriespodcast.com. And remember that all of our links can be found in the show notes. And now, let's begin the show with our first listener story of the night, which comes to us from Stacy. And Stacy's story is called Grandma's Back Room, Mom's Apartment, and Slender. Stacy says, "Hi Nick, I've been wanting to write in ever since I heard the listener's story from a girl in Cheyenne, Wyoming who wrote about the Atlas Theater. I too live in Cheyenne and was shocked to hear that you accepted a submission letter from someone here, since Wyoming is often overlooked as one of the least populated states. I've only had a handful of strange experiences in my life, nothing too crazy, but I've been putting off sharing them until yesterday when I heard you mention the Slender Man in episode 168. The first time I ever experienced anything possibly paranormal was when I was 15, living with my grandma in Laramie, Wyoming. My uncle committed suicide a few months prior to this, and I was thinking about him constantly. My bedroom was in the back of the house, and one night while I was laying in bed facing the wall with my back toward the edge of the bed, I was remembering a particular memory of my uncle touching my hair and telling me how much he loved it because it reminded him of Indian hair, very thick, sleek, and soft. Just then, I felt someone stroke my hair from the back of my head down to the middle of my shoulder blades. I sat straight up in my bed and looked around the dark room with my heart pounding in my ears, part of me expecting to see him at my bedside. It was startling, but I was overwhelmed with comfort immediately after. Another night in this back room, I was trying to fall asleep, but I kept hearing a noise coming from my closet. I knew exactly what the noise was because I heard it every time I opened and closed my closet door. It was the sound of the door dragging across the carpet, which took some effort since the carpet was starting to raise up in that area because it was old and needed to be stretched. The noise was very gradual, as if someone was sneakily opening it inch by inch to peek in on me. After laying there frozen in place for about a minute, I finally gathered the courage to raise my head and look. As I stared into the darkness of the closet with the room lit only by the dim moonlight, everything was quiet for a few seconds, until I heard the noise suddenly, and I saw the door move just a little bit. I jumped up and flipped the light on, and then walked to the door to try and nudge it gently to see how it moved. As normal, it wouldn't budge without me pulling or pushing on it because of the rolled carpet. All windows were closed, and there wasn't a draft of any sort coming from anywhere in the house. After these things happened, I told my family about it, and everyone who has ever stayed in that back room had something unnerving to say about it. Another weird experience happened when I was 20 and living in an old apartment in downtown Cheyenne, which was originally rented out by my mom, but my husband Frank and I took over the lease so that she could move back to Laramie with my grandma and stay in that creepy back room. Frank always left for work around 7 a.m. while I slept in for another hour or so. When he left, he kissed me goodbye as usual, and I heard him lock the door on his way out. What seemed like just a few minutes after, I started to toss and turn, thinking that I was smelling gas from our stove. I shouted out to Frank to ask what he was cooking, but I didn't hear anything back. I kept smelling the fumes get stronger until I got out of bed and walked into the kitchen, expecting to see him, but I only saw the front door locked the way he left it, in the empty kitchen. A burner was turned on medium-high. No flame, only running gas. Immediately I shut it off, and I called my husband. I asked him if he had used the stove or went into the kitchen before he left, thinking that he might have bumped the knob on his way out, but he told me that he never even went into the kitchen because he was running late and only had time to get dressed and brush his teeth before he left. I told him about the stove, and neither one of us could think of an explanation. Not to mention the time was now 8:05, over an hour after Frank had left. And with our tiny one-bedroom apartment, I should have been able to smell the gas within just a couple of minutes of it running on medium-high. Another incident in this same apartment took place one afternoon when Frank went to my dad's house to work on a project. About 10 minutes after he left, I stepped into the shower, and suddenly, clear as day, I heard Frank yell, "Babe." I nonchalantly replied, "Yeah?" but no response. Louder, I shouted, "What?" and again nothing. Finally, feeling frustrated because I was covered in soap, I grabbed my towel, walked into the bedroom, and again said, "What, babe?" I looked out the window expecting to see his blue truck in its parking space, but it was gone. In my head, I was thinking there was no possible way that he could have left that quick since we lived on the 3rd floor, and only about 15 seconds had passed from the time I heard him to the time I looked out the window. I called him and asked if he had come back home for something, but he told me that he had just barely arrived at my dad's house, and I could hear both my dad and his bench saw in the background. This time I was so freaked out that I rinsed off, dressed as quickly as I could, and left the apartment because I felt an uneasiness, like I wasn't alone anymore. My mom mentioned that on occasion, strange things like loud bangs on the bedroom wall above her headboard would wake her up in the middle of the night. But after this day, nothing else ever happened to me. Finally, this last experience took place just a couple of years ago when I was on my way home and it was late, around 2 a.m. A few months before this night, my sister showed me a documentary on Hulu about Slender Man and the two girls who stabbed their friend because they believed Slender told them to do it. It was disturbing, and I had trouble sleeping that night, but I soon put it out of my mind. Anyway, on this night I was on my way home. I was driving down a one-way street that turns off onto the street where my house is, and it also merges into a large roundabout. Before my turn, I noticed someone walking on the side of the road. He was abnormally tall and skinny with unusually long arms, both slightly bent at the elbows. His body shape reminded me of Jack Skellington from The Nightmare Before Christmas. He was dressed in dark clothing that covered everything except his hands and head. I pumped the brakes a bit, but couldn't get a good look at his face because it was dark in my rearview mirror. Right away I was reminded about the documentary, and I felt chills go down my back. After my turn, I called my sister to tell her what I just saw. I shakily described him to her, and I emphasized how eerily similar he was to the way Slender Man is portrayed in all the fan art. Feeling compelled by curiosity to turn back, I told my sister to stay on the phone with me. Full of adrenaline, I turned back onto the road and tried to spot him through the haze of the early morning fog. By this time, he was walking straight across the roundabout. I rolled the window down to stick my head out and get a better look, but kept my distance because I felt the dread grow the closer I came to him. His walk was strange, slow and steady with a slight drag in one of his feet, and all movement was only in his legs while the rest of his body was still. I could see more details under the streetlights of the roundabout, such as his head. He was very pale with no visible hair, and I couldn't see his face. He was dressed in what looked like a black suit with white sleeves showing under the jacket, and at this point I was barely going 5 miles an hour before I came to a complete stop in the middle of the road. Now he was walking smack dab in the middle of the road, almost crossing over into the opposite lane, seemingly oblivious to everything around him. I put my sister on FaceTime, turned the flashlight on, and zoomed in a little so that she could see what I was looking at. It was only us on the road, and come to think of it, I don't remember ever seeing another car drive by at all. For a few seconds it was dead silence, like all time was frozen in place. Just then, the silence was broken when 2 police officers pulled up next to me. One of them said, "What are you doing? You're going to cause an accident." I shouted back, "I'm sorry, I was just about to call you because of this person walking down the street. I don't know if he's hurt or drunk or what, but he's freaking me out." At this point, I was almost in tears, and they told me to go home so that they could handle it. I was so afraid to go near the man that I asked the cops if I could do a U-turn instead of driving past him. In my rearview mirror, I saw them turn their red and blue lights on and shine their bright spotlight on him, but he didn't turn around. Later, my sister and I three-way called our friend Amber to tell her. I remember describing him to her as a thing or an it because it was too difficult to even call him a man because of how freaky he looked. I slept with all the lights on that night and away from all the windows. For the next week, I checked the police blotters to see if I could find anything about it, but there was nothing. I know Slender Man is a fictional character made up by a group of students, but I will never forget what I saw or how disturbing it was, and I'll always wonder what really happened after the cops stopped him, and who he really was. I know these accounts aren't much, especially compared to some of the off-the-wall experiences mentioned on the show, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to share them anyway. Our next story of the night comes to us from T, and T's story is called Regarding a Story from R in Freeland, Michigan. The episode that T is referring to is episode 91, which I'll put a link to in the show notes. T says, R from Freeland, Michigan messaged you. I'm not sure when, but you shared his experience from when he was very little, about the creatures looking in his window, and his father finding footprints later. R is my boyfriend and had told me the story, but never in the detail I just heard on your podcast. He often puts it on just for me to listen to because I do like these kinds of things, and it's nice to not feel alone when it comes to odd experiences. That being said, he and I both have been magnets for it our entire lives, and just knowing each other before being together seems to have magnified it all. That being said, I sleep under a loft area. We both work overnight, so I basically have a blanket fort going to block the light out since we sleep early. One night while in bed with R, both of us in a deep sleep, I suddenly woke up. My eyes popped open and I saw a face retreat behind the blanket that hides out the light. I honestly couldn't describe the face if I wanted to, but I do remember its large almond eyes and the very non-human fingers that slowly let go of the blanket. They were large, long, and rounded with no nails, and its skin color was greenish-gray. It's like whatever it was simply peeking in on us, watching us while we slept. Oddly, I didn't feel any kind of fear. It was more like an, oh, okay, kind of feeling, and then I drifted back to sleep. I told him about it the next morning, and he looked troubled, but I tried to calm him down by saying how it made me feel, and that it just felt like more or less a how are they visit. So that's my weird story that goes along with his. I've had other off events that are very odd. This was the first with him around that dealt with something like he experienced, or with things like he experienced when he was young. Our next story comes to us from Joel, and Joel's story is called Haunted Military Bases. Joel says, when I was in the U.S. Navy, I was stationed in Groton, Connecticut in 2006 to 2007. There was a lot of history there, including the site of a Revolutionary War battle at Fort Griswold, which overlooks the Thames River. There were massive losses on both sides of the Battle of Groton Heights, where Benedict Arnold raided the fort and killed most of the remaining Connecticut militia. I went there with 3 or 4 friends from base one night, and when we arrived outside the fort, I could feel serious dread and fear. Upon entering the fort, I felt a crowd of people around me, even though it was only me and a few friends. The feeling was overwhelming and like I was not actually in 2006. It felt as though I had traveled back through time and could almost see what was going on between the British and Americans. It is definitely a site to visit if you want to feel something strange. My next experience is of a dark or demonic presence. It was one cold night in winter. Snow on the ground and snow falling from a blanket of clouds overhead. When I was on my way from the galley or chow hall to my barracks, I felt a presence that was watching and following me. As I walked on the sidewalk along the right side of the 2-lane road, I kept looking over to the woods on the left side of the road, and I could have sworn I saw something. I stopped walking under a streetlight and stood there staring across the street, trying to see what was there. What I saw froze me. Passing tree to tree, keeping up with me was a dark shadow with dark red eyes, and it was the only feature I could see. It ducked behind a tree directly across from me and peered out from behind the tree at me before coming out completely. It emerged entirely from behind the tree and stood there facing me broadside and stared at me. As I stood there frozen, it slunk back behind the tree and then ran to the next tree. This dark creature stood out against the snowy background, and it didn't cast a shadow. It was one of the scariest nights of my life. Next was one night when I was on duty during a tropical storm. I began patrolling my barracks as regularly scheduled. While on the first floor entering the south wing towards the laundry room, the power went out. Immediately the generators came on, as did the hallway red emergency lights. At that moment, I saw the ghost of a young man standing there only in his skivvies, with a white bedsheet twisted and tied around his neck. He was standing there facing me down the hallway from me. He looked sad and lost. He turned toward the laundry room while keeping his eyes on me, and slowly walked into the laundry room. I ran down the hallway into the locker room and looked for him, but to no avail. There was only one door, and I had just gone through it. The only windows in the room were locked, and from the outside were high above the ground. There were pipes hanging from the ceiling and multiple rows of laundry machines. The ghost was nowhere to be seen. I then ran all the way back to the lobby where our check-in desk was, and I told the BPO, or barracks manager, who then told me what had happened. Apparently, years ago a young sailor had hung himself in that same laundry room. I didn't feel fear of danger from this ghost, but I definitely felt some fear of the unknown. I felt bad for him. like he transferred his sadness and pain to me. Lastly, one night I was patrolling the submarine school building, and as I walked through the hall, I could hear a little girl giggling and running, which was weird because no kids were allowed in the building. I looked all through the hall while on patrol, and I could not see anyone anywhere. My hair stood on end, and I got goosebumps, so I went to the staircase and went down to the next floor. As I did, I heard what sounded like a little girl screaming and then falling. That scared me, and when I finished and went to the front desk, I brought it up. I don't know if they were messing with me hearing about this, but apparently other sailors on patrol had heard the same thing. They told me that it was the daughter of an officer who toured the building and fell to her death on a staircase. I believe the Navy submarine school in Groton, Connecticut to be very haunted, with its very long existence, and the town as well. If you ever get the chance, try to make it there. I'm sorry for the long story, but it gives me the strong belief in ghosts and demons. Joel. Our next story of the night comes to us from E, and E says, "Hello Nick, and greetings from Montana. I hope this email reaches you in excellent health. I ran across your podcast last week while getting ready for work and have been binging on every episode throughout my days since. Since I first listened to your podcast, I wanted to share one of my many stories with you. I have always been sort of a believer when it comes to ghosts, spirits, and unseen entities. I think this belief mainly stems from when I was younger, as you will find out in the story. This story spans most of my life and a couple of different locations as I have moved houses a couple of times, so I know that they are all connected and not just hauntings of the homes. This story is about what I have come to know as shadow people. I first encountered these shadow people when I was about 5 or 6. At the time, I shared a room with my slightly older brother, who I will call D. I remember that one day I was sitting on my bed that was on the side of our squarish room furthest away from the door. Now, our closet doors were at the foot of my bed, straight across from the door. As I was sitting on my bed, I noticed the closet doors open slightly, and a completely black shadow floated out of the closet and out through the door. I got scared and ran out of my room and into the living room where my mom and Dee were watching TV. I told my mom what had happened, but she shrugged it off as childhood imagination. I should say that this was during the afternoon while the sun was still high in the sky. I never saw the shadow again when we lived in that house, but I had other experiences in it. The second time I saw a shadow person was a handful of years later. We had just moved into a new house in North Dakota, and I was about 11 at the time. Since we had just moved in, only my mom's bed had arrived, so Dee and I slept in her bed. My mom's bedroom was on the second floor of her house and had a window facing an orange-colored streetlight that cast a little light into the room at night. When we went to sleep that night, my mom slept on the left side of the bed, Dee in the middle, and I was on the right side of the bed. When I went to bed, I had a small green blanket of mine wrapped around me because I was always cold. Later in the middle of the night, I woke up because I was freezing. That's when I rolled over to see if my blanket had fallen off the side of the bed. Now, my side of the bed faced the window and the light from the street. When I rolled over, there was the shadow of what looked like a giant man. The shadow was so thick that I couldn't see the light through him. I froze and couldn't move as the shadow lowered his head close to mine. It looked like it then raised one of its arms toward me, and then I remembered screwing my eyes shut. When I opened my eyes, the shadow was near the window, and it stayed for about a second before dissolving like smoke into the air. I then grabbed my blanket off the floor and moved closer to my brother, and when I calmed down the scare, I fell asleep. The last time I saw one of these shadow people was fairly recently, just a month ago. I am currently 17 and now living with my dad. I have my own room, which used to be my stepmom's office, so it's not very big, just 9 or so feet wide and 12 feet long. That day we had spent most of our time working cows and sheep, and we were glad to come in and go to bed. I laid a blanket on the floor for my cat, who sleeps at the foot of my dresser, which is halfway between the door and my bed, which takes up the section of wall opposite of the door. I quickly fell asleep and felt like I wasn't asleep for long before I opened my eyes and found that I couldn't move. I could only stare toward my door as a shadow darkened in the middle of my room, close to where the cat slept. It grew so dark that the small light from the hallway on the other side of my room was completely blocked out. It was tall and thin and didn't move. It just hovered a few inches off the ground, and I could feel it watching me. After a minute or two, my cat suddenly woke up and started to have a fit. She started yowling and hissing at the shadow that floated next to her. The shadow almost immediately dissolved like smoke, and my stepbrother came running into my room to see why the cat was howling, since he was in the living room with a friend staying up late and playing Xbox. I told him what had happened, but he didn't believe me, and he then took the cat into the living room to try and keep her quiet. I had trouble sleeping after that. And after that, I have always kept my cat with me while I slept, because at least she could see what I could. Sorry for the long story, but it would mean a lot to me if you read it on your podcast. If anyone knows why this keeps happening or how I can stop it, please let me know. Thanks for reading, and I love your podcast and the space you created to share stories like this with people who won't shrug you off. Thanks again, E. As we come to the end of tonight's episode, I appreciate all of you for tuning in, and a special thank you goes out to Stacy, T, Joel, and E for sharing their experiences. And if you've had a paranormal experience and would like to share your story, you can contact me through email, voice message, or on our website, and these links can be found in the show notes. Until next time, I hope you all have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here on Monday with our next episode. From everyone at Paranormal Mysteries, thank you for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.